On Monday evening, October 28, 1929, Charles Mitchell walked back into 55 Wall Street with the most expensive smile in America. The market had just fallen by a terrifying amount. Not a normal bad day. Not a rough afternoon. A collapse so violent that the financial district had begun watching faces instead of prices. The traders outside watched Mitchell because he was not just another banker. He was chairman of National City Bank, the largest bank in the United States, a man the press called Sunshine Charlie, and one of the loudest believers in the idea that American finance could be made bigger, broader, and more democratic. He had spent the afternoon at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, trying to solve a panic in public while another panic formed in private. A month earlier, Mitchell had been arranging to make National City even larger by absorbing Corn Exchange Bank. The deal depended on confidence in National City stock. Now confidence was the one product Wall Street could no longer manufacture. When Mitchell learned how much National City stock had been taken onto the bank's books that day, the scale of the danger landed at once. The bank did not have unlimited cash. Its prestige did not make arithmetic disappear. The institution he had built as a machine of optimism suddenly looked like something more fragile, a balance sheet filled with assumptions. This episode is about how America arrived at that room. Not the crash itself. Not yet. Before panic became obvious, it had spent months wearing better clothes. It appeared in private offices, hotel dining rooms, radio studios, Senate letters, investment plans, brokerage windows, and the thin strip of paper that told Americans the future had a price. The question for episode 1 is simple: how did speculation become ordinary life? To answer that, we begin months earlier, with a man who understood better than almost anyone that the market was not only numbers. It was emotion wearing a hat. That architecture is built from incentives, from institutions that seem rational in isolation. A bank expands credit because customers want opportunity and competitors are doing the same. A broker offers margin because customers demand access and rising prices make the risk feel manageable. A regulator hesitates because a clumsy warning can trigger the very crisis it is meant to prevent. A politician denounces gambling because capital appears to be leaving farms and factories for Wall Street. A speculator borrows because every month of rising prices makes debt look like intelligence. None of these decisions requires a villain. That is what makes the story harder and more useful. A bubble is not a bank robbery. It is a social arrangement in which the benefit of continuing is immediate, private, and measurable, while the cost of stopping seems theoretical, public, and easy to postpone. That is why this episode begins before October. We will not yet ask why the market crashed. We will ask why it became so hard to imagine that it could. The crash will come later. First comes the seduction. On March 4, 1929, Herbert Hoover became President of the United States. He entered office with almost impossible confidence around him. The press had largely celebrated his election. He had business credentials, engineering discipline, and a reputation for competence. He had made his own fortune before government, then built a public career as a manager of emergencies. But Wall Street did not quite know what to make of him. Hoover believed the economy could be managed. He was not a simple do-nothing heir to Coolidge. He was an engineer with a pencil, a pad, and a belief that systems could be improved by intelligent coordination. That made some financiers uneasy. To reassure business, Hoover kept Andrew Mellon at Treasury. Mellon came from Pittsburgh industry and believed that buying and selling securities were private matters. If Americans wanted to speculate, Washington did not need to act as referee. Under Mellon, the tax treatment of capital gains had become more favorable to investors. Hoover worried about speculation. Mellon preferred restraint in government intervention. The Federal Reserve argued with itself about credit. Wall Street wanted the freedom to keep lending. The early months of 1929 reveal a government trying to avoid two humiliations at once: act too sharply, and Washington might be blamed for killing prosperity; act too softly, and Washington might be blamed for letting speculation metastasize. This is how bubbles paralyze authority. They make every intervention look like the possible cause of the crash, right up until non-intervention becomes part of the cause. 10 days earlier, Charles Mitchell had attended a meeting at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He had recently joined its board, a mark of trust and status, and also a compromise. The New York Fed's late governor, Benjamin Strong, had understood that Mitchell could be useful inside the room and dangerous outside it. Mitchell had spent years building National City into something more than an old bank. He wanted a modern financial services empire, what he called the bank for all. That meant deposits, securities, loans, and ordinary customers. He did not want Wall Street to remain a club for insiders. He wanted average Americans brought into the machine. To Mitchell, credit was not a moral failing. Americans already used installment loans to buy radios, refrigerators, and automobiles. Why should stock be different? If modern corporations represented the future, then lending against their shares seemed, to him, like lending against progress itself. The risk is that democratization can hide extraction. A bank can broaden access and deepen dependence at the same time. A customer can feel newly included while becoming newly exposed. Mitchell's vision made finance more available, but it also normalized the idea that ordinary household balance sheets should be connected to market prices. Once a household begins measuring itself against the market enters the home. A wage is no longer the only source of progress. A savings account is no longer the only proof of prudence. The paper gain becomes part of dinner conversation, part of status, part of future planning. The Federal Reserve was young, barely 15 years old, and divided by design. It had regional banks, a board in Washington, and a constant tension between local financial power and national public responsibility. By early 1929, the board had become alarmed that Federal Reserve credit was indirectly feeding stock speculation. Money meant to support commerce and production was flowing into brokers' loans and margin accounts. This was not a simple choice between wisdom and foolishness. Raising rates might slow the real economy. Doing nothing might let speculation grow larger and more dangerous. Direct pressure might cut credit to the market, but it could also trigger exactly the panic it was meant to prevent. Every policy path had a trapdoor. A Federal Reserve statement could become prudence in Washington, threat in New York, and panic in the branch office. Mitchell believed he understood that translation better than the policymakers did. From his desk, the Fed's restraint did not look like careful surgery. It looked like pressure applied to a crowded theater. 2 days after Mitchell's meeting at the New York Fed, he called William Crapo Durant in Flint, Michigan. Durant had founded General Motors, lost control of it, returned, lost control again, and reinvented himself as one of the most visible speculators in America. The stock market was not a side interest for him. It was the great stage on which American enterprise proved itself. Mitchell and Durant shared a grievance: the Federal Reserve. They believed Washington did not understand the market and that efforts to restrict credit could cause the very disaster the Fed feared. Durant pushed the argument further. If investors could not borrow against good American securities, then credit would tighten not only for speculators but for the whole web of business: cotton planters, farmers, merchants, manufacturers. The argument had power because it was not wholly false. The danger had power because it was not wholly true. Durant's genius as a salesman was that he could make self-interest sound like national interest, because, in an economy built on credit, the two were genuinely tangled. The day after Hoover's inauguration, a small group of Wall Street reporters arrived at the Heckscher Building, not Wall Street, but Midtown, 5th Avenue, and 57th Street. They had been invited by Jesse Livermore, one of the most famous speculators in America and one of the least available men in finance. Wall Street had called him the Boy Plunger, a nickname that made him sound younger and wilder than he was. By 1929 he was 51, still lean, still watchful, and far more private. Years earlier, the pressure of public notoriety had driven him away from the noise of the financial district into a custom-built Midtown headquarters. The reporters had heard stories about the place. Few outsiders had seen it. The building staff were under instructions to deny that Livermore's office even existed. His operation looked like a private exchange. Dozens of phone lines. Telegraph machines. A chalkboard large enough to turn prices into weather. It was a place built for watching the market breathe. And yet the subject Livermore had called the reporters to discuss was not the stock market. He spoke about cotton. Imagine being allowed inside one of the most secretive trading rooms in New York, only to discover that the Great Bear of Wall Street has invited you to discuss a commodity most stock speculators were not thinking about that morning. But the apparent anticlimax is exactly what makes the scene valuable. Livermore understood attention. He knew reporters would write not only what he said, but the fact that he had allowed them into the room. The office, the private elevator, the clerks, the tickers under glass, all of it performed authority. He did not need to shout. The room shouted for him. And still, when the reporters wanted his view on the stock market, he withheld it. In a market where everyone was being invited to have an opinion, the most famous speculator in the room kept the most valuable opinion out of print. That restraint is one of the first clues to the real story. Livermore's reputation came from a trade most Americans found almost morally backward: short selling. Most investors buy first and hope to sell later at a higher price. A short seller reverses the order. He borrows shares, sells them immediately, waits for the price to fall, buys them back cheaper, returns what he borrowed, and keeps the difference. The important word is borrowed. A short seller creates an obligation. If the price falls, that obligation becomes easier to satisfy. If the price rises, the obligation becomes heavier, and there is no natural limit to how heavy it can get. To short a market in love with itself is to stand in front of a parade and insist the street is about to end. Livermore had done it before. He had made and lost fortunes. He had learned that being early can be almost the same as being wrong. A bubble can punish intelligence longer than most people can fund conviction. The real Livermore move came later. By Sunday, March 24th, the market had become jittery. The Federal Reserve was trying to restrain speculation. Traders were waiting to see what Washington would do. The next morning, March 25th, Livermore prepared to act. His traders gathered before the market opened. The order was simple in spirit and enormous in scale: sell short. By the end of the day, the position was vast. Livermore had pressed his capital and credit to the edge. If the market rose, he could be ruined. If it fell, he could make a fortune in hours. The next day, March 26th, the market fell, sharply enough to make Wall Street feel the floor move. But the bigger story was not simply that one speculator made money. It was that the market was now so leveraged, so dependent on credit, that a drop could become a mechanical event. Selling pushed prices down. Falling prices triggered calls for more cash. Demands for cash forced more selling. The machine had human parts, but it was issuing commands. On Tuesday, March 26, 1929, Wall Street discovered something more frightening than a falling market. It discovered a market that could not fall in an orderly way. The ticker was behind. Brokers were running between posts. Customers were being told to send more cash or watch their accounts close. Money that had felt abundant the week before suddenly had a price, and the price kept climbing. This was not October. Not yet. There were no famous photographs of ruined men on sidewalks. No national memory had formed around the day. But for a few hours, the machinery of the boom showed its gears. Prices fell. Margin calls followed. Selling forced more selling. Credit became harder to find at exactly the moment everyone needed it. Then one banker stepped forward and taught the market a lesson it would not forget. The lesson was not safety. It was rescue. 2 days earlier, on Sunday, March 24th, the market was already nervous. The Federal Reserve had been trying to restrain speculative credit. Washington did not want money meant for commerce to keep pouring into brokers' loans and margin accounts. The warning was cautious in official language, but Wall Street translated it more sharply: credit might become harder to get. That mattered because the boom was no longer just a story about optimism. It was a story about borrowed optimism. Millions of dollars in stock purchases depended on loans. Investors did not need to pay the whole price of a share. They could put down a portion, borrow the rest, and enjoy the rise as if the gain belonged entirely to them. In a rising market, this felt clever. In a falling market, it became a trap with paperwork. Jesse Livermore understood that trap. He had watched the market long enough to know that a crowd can be confident and fragile at the same time. By late March, the mood had changed. The boom was still standing, but it had started listening for bad news. That is the condition short sellers wait for, not collapse, but vulnerability. On Monday morning, March 25, Livermore prepared to act. The order was simple in spirit and enormous in consequence: sell short. He was not making a speech. He was not publishing a prophecy. He was using the market's own machinery against the market's mood. His traders sold borrowed shares into a market that still wanted to believe it was strong. That distinction matters. Livermore was not standing outside the system as a moral witness. He was inside it, using leverage, credit, secrecy, timing, and appetite like everyone else. The man betting against the danger of borrowed money was borrowing against his own conviction. If the market rose, he could be destroyed. If it fell, he could make a fortune in hours. That is why the March short campaign is not only a story about one trader's nerve. It is a story about the whole structure. Livermore's position worked because the market had become sensitive to pressure. A sell order did not merely change a price. It could start a chain. Falling prices weakened collateral. Weak collateral created margin calls. Margin calls forced customers to find cash. Customers who could not find cash had to sell. More selling pushed prices lower. The market had become a room where one shout could move the walls. The phrase that mattered on March 26 was call money. Call money was short-term lending that brokers used to finance customer margin accounts. It could be called back quickly. That made it useful in calm times and terrifying in stress. When money was easy, call loans helped the market expand. When money tightened, the same loans became a demand for cash. On March 26, call money rates climbed sharply. Brokers' loans became more expensive. Banks grew cautious. Accounts that had looked comfortable while prices rose suddenly needed fresh margin. Nothing about this required mass hysteria. That is the unsettling part. A broker warning a customer was following rules. A bank raising the price of money was responding to risk. A customer selling stock to meet a call was making the only choice available. Each person could be reasonable in isolation. Together, they created the possibility of panic. This is what leverage does. It turns price movement into obligation. In an unleveraged market, a falling stock can disappoint people. In a leveraged market, a falling stock can command them. It can demand cash by afternoon. It can make a man sell what he wanted to keep. It can make a bank protect itself at the exact moment everyone else needs help. By midday, Wall Street was not simply asking whether stocks were worth less. It was asking whether enough money existed to hold the boom together. Charles Mitchell saw the danger from inside National City Bank. Mitchell was not a cautious outsider tutting at speculation. He was one of the men who had helped make finance feel modern, expansive, and democratic. National City had become a symbol of the new financial age: securities, deposits, loans, and ordinary customers drawn into the same machine. To Washington, restraint looked like responsibility. To Mitchell, restraint on March 26 looked like a match dropped in a crowded theater. He decided that the Federal Reserve Board was not going to save the market quickly enough. If brokers could not get money, forced selling could feed on itself. If forced selling fed on itself, panic could become real before policy had finished sounding prudent. So Mitchell used the power he had. National City would lend. The news moved through Wall Street with the speed of relief. A great bank was standing behind the market. Money would be available. The fall slowed. Prices steadied. The street read Mitchell's action in the old language of rescue, almost as if J.P. Morgan had returned in a modern suit. For that afternoon, it worked. That is the dangerous part of the story. The March panic passed. Livermore had seen fragility and made money from it. Mitchell had seen fragility and covered it with credit. Both men had understood something true. One understood that the market could break. The other understood that, for now, a powerful bank could stop it from breaking. Wall Street preferred Mitchell's truth. It was easier to live with. If credit tightened, perhaps credit could be restored. If the market fell, perhaps a banker could step in. If Washington pushed too hard, perhaps New York could improvise. The rescue did not merely calm the market. It gave the market a story about itself. The story said, "We were tested, and we survived." That is one of the most dangerous sentences in a bubble. A near miss can become a warning. It can also become proof of invincibility. The difference depends on what people choose to remember. Wall Street remembered the recovery more vividly than the conditions that made recovery necessary. The lesson should have been that the market was dependent on short-term credit, vulnerable to forced selling, and frighteningly sensitive to confidence. The lesson many people absorbed was simpler: when things get bad enough, someone important may rescue the tape. The rescue did not end the argument. It sharpened it. To critics of speculation, Mitchell had not saved the economy. He had saved the speculators from learning the cost of their own borrowing. Carter Glass and others would see the episode as evidence that Wall Street's private power had become too large, too political, and too willing to defy restraint. But for the market, the immediate message was not criticism. It was survival. Stocks had dropped. Call money had tightened. The ticker had fallen behind. A famous short seller had pressed the decline. Then a famous banker had supplied credit, and the floor had appeared beneath everyone's feet. The boom continued. That continuation matters more than the scare itself. March did not break the market. It trained it. It showed investors what danger felt like, then rewarded them for staying. It taught the public that fear could be temporary. It taught speculators that rescue was possible. It taught bankers that intervention could look heroic. It taught policymakers that every attempt to restrain speculation might be blamed for the panic it was meant to prevent. The spring of 1929 did not remove the danger. It educated the danger. By the time summer arrived, the market had a memory of rescue. And a market with a memory of rescue can become braver than its balance sheet deserves. The crash was still months away. But one of its most important rehearsals had already happened. Nobody called it a rehearsal. That is why it worked. On Friday, March 29, 1929, Thomas Lamont was supposed to be resting in the hills outside Florence. He had left Paris after weeks of tense negotiations over German reparations. A villa, a week with his family, a little distance from New York, that was the idea. Then the telegrams arrived. Across the Atlantic, a secret communications deal was leaking into the newspapers. It involved RCA, Western Union, ITT, and some of the most powerful men in American finance. To Lamont, it was not merely a merger. It was a chance to build the future and put the House of Morgan at the center of it. But the same stock that made the deal glamorous was already moving beyond anyone's control. RCA was not trading like an ordinary company. It was trading like a national dream. The market had just survived the March panic. The lesson might have been caution. Instead, in the days that followed, Wall Street found new men, new stories, and new machines for selling confidence. Radio was perfect for 1929 because it felt impossible to doubt. Millions of Americans were bringing sets into their homes. Voices, music, news, sermons, comedy, and presidential speeches traveled through the air as if the country had acquired a new nervous system. Radio made the future intimate. You could put it in the parlor. You could gather around it at night. You could hear the modern world entering the room. RCA sat at the center of that imagination. Investors called the stock radio, as if the company and the invention were the same thing. It promised patents, broadcasting, advertising, international cables, and even technologies that were not yet fully commercial. That is what made it dangerous. A factory could be inspected. A balance sheet could be questioned. But the future was harder to price and easier to sell. It did not have to arrive all at once. It could be suggested by a shop window, a new aerial on a roof, a family leaning toward a speaker, or a newspaper paragraph about the next great combination. The public was not irrational to be fascinated. Radio really was changing daily life. The danger was that a real invention could be turned into a financial costume. Once a stock became a symbol, every rumor about the future could become an argument to buy. After the March rescue, buyers were not simply buying earnings. They were buying the feeling that progress itself had a ticker symbol. Michael Meehan understood that feeling better than almost anyone. On the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, he was the official specialist in RCA. His post was number 12, and visitors in the gallery knew to look for him there because radio was the stock everyone wanted to see. The specialist's public role was order. Match buyers and sellers. Keep the market liquid. Make trading look controlled. Meehan's private role was more profitable. In March, he circulated a confidential pool plan to favored customers and allied brokers. The idea was not subtle. With enough money behind him, Meehan believed he could push RCA upward, make the tape look alive, and draw the public into the move. The pool gathered millions of dollars. William Durant joined. Walter Chrysler joined. Money came through personal accounts, brokerage accounts, and in some cases wives' names. Then the show began. Pool members bought and sold in coordination. They kept themselves apart on the floor. They made activity look like demand. Financial columns and market talk did the rest. To the public, RCA seemed to be rising because the future had arrived. Behind the motion was a group of men arranging the appearance of motion. When the pool sold into the public excitement, the insiders made fortunes. Nothing important about radio had changed that week. The story had changed. And in 1929, a story could move money faster than evidence. The most disturbing part was how ordinary it could look. A pool was not a masked robbery. It used brokerage accounts, exchange procedure, press chatter, and the public's own excitement. It took the visible forms of capitalism and filled them with a private script. Carter Glass looked at the same market and saw something uglier. Glass was not a simple hero. He was a segregationist and a defender of Jim Crow. But on the banking system, he was one of the most knowledgeable men in Washington, and he believed Wall Street was bending the Federal Reserve toward private speculation. After Charles Mitchell's rescue, Glass watched stocks rise again and grew furious. Mitchell had used National City's power to support the call loan market at the very moment the Federal Reserve was trying to restrain speculative credit. To Wall Street, Mitchell had saved the market. To Glass, he had defied the public purpose of the banking system. Glass was often ill. He did not need a crowded Senate floor to fight. He used letters. Dictated letters. Sharp letters. Letters from hospital rooms and hotels. He wanted Mitchell disciplined because the issue was no longer just whether stocks went up. The issue was who governed credit when speculation became too large to offend. That is why Glass matters here. His warning did not stop the boom, and his own politics were morally stained. But he saw a structural danger clearly. When a market becomes dependent on rescue, every attempt to discipline it can be made to look like the real threat. William C. Durant decided to take the argument directly to the president. He traveled quietly from New York to Washington. Only his wife knew the purpose. He avoided the usual display, arrived at the Carlton Hotel near the White House, and prepared his case. Durant had built and lost empires before. He understood promotion, confidence, and the emotional weather of business. In his mind, the Federal Reserve was not protecting the country by tightening credit. It was threatening prosperity itself. His argument was built for Herbert Hoover. Durant brought the language of evidence, a poll of company executives, the claim that business leaders did not see their stocks as overpriced, the warning that restraint would damage the whole economy. At night, he managed to get into the White House and put the case before Hoover. Hoover listened, but he was not persuaded. He suspected prices would eventually come down to earth without the president becoming the market's visible guardian. Durant left the meeting with the burden placed where he wanted it. If disaster came, he had warned the president. It was salesmanship in its most serious form. Durant was not merely talking up a stock. He was trying to define the boundary between speculation and prosperity. If he could make those two things sound inseparable, then restraint could be painted as sabotage. John J. Raskob sold confidence with a smoother hand. He was rich, famous, restless, and everywhere: DuPont, General Motors, Democratic politics, Catholic organizations, stock pools, newspaper attention, private dinners, public forecasts. He had climbed from stenographer to one of the most powerful business figures in America, and he treated organization as a kind of magic. Raskob had profited from the RCA pool. He was comfortable with debt in a country that had once treated debt as shame. He believed capital could organize almost anything: companies, parties, elections, headlines, even public feeling. In April, he was preparing a dinner at the Carlton House for Democratic leaders. Officially, it was about party debt and political strategy after Al Smith's defeat. Beneath that was something larger. Raskob wanted to apply the methods of finance to politics: permanent fundraising, professional headquarters, loyal networks, pressure applied all year round. This mattered because the boom was no longer just a market phenomenon. Its techniques were migrating. Pools, publicity, leverage, social obligation, and moneyed confidence were becoming a broader language of power. The same habits that made a market pool work could make a political network work. Find the right people. Gather commitments. Keep the public message simple. Make hesitation feel provincial and confidence feel modern. Raskob had not invented that language, but he spoke it fluently. When Durant could not move Hoover privately, he tried the public. On Sunday night, April 14th, he went to Steinway Hall, where WAC had a broadcast studio high above 57th Street. He had bought 15 minutes of airtime. The audience was not a brokerage office or a Senate committee. It was the radio public. Durant told listeners that the country was in a struggle between business and the Federal Reserve. He blamed the March scare on official restraint. He praised Mitchell. He argued that stock ownership had spread through the country and that securities credit was tied to prosperity itself. In other words, he did what the men of the boom kept doing. He made speculation sound like citizenship. Radio gave that argument a new intimacy. A banker could publish a statement. A senator could write a letter. A newspaper could frame the dispute in columns. But a voice in the home was different. It did not feel like Wall Street shouting from a distance. It felt like reassurance arriving through the furniture. Critics in Washington heard a self-interested speculator protecting his book. Many listeners heard something easier to live with: a businessman saying the danger came not from too much confidence, but from those trying to restrain it. That was the achievement of spring 1929. The market had revealed its fragility, and yet professionals found ways to make buying feel rational again. Lamont had the future. Meehan had the pool. Raskob had the method. Durant had the microphone. The rescue did not end the boom. It taught the boom how to sell itself. On Saturday, June 29, 1929, Charles Mitchell walked into the Plaza Hotel as if the city itself belonged to him. Outside were horses, cars, summer visitors, and the Marble Theatre of Fifth Avenue. Inside, lunch was underway. Bankers, tourists, politicians, speculators, and society watchers filled the rooms. The market had just closed at another high. Money felt less like something earned than something in the air. The old Oak Room Bar was gone, closed by prohibition. In its place stood an E.F. Hutton brokerage office. The substitution was almost too perfect. One legal intoxication had replaced another. Mitchell arrived with William Durant. Across the dining room were John Raskob, Earl Smith, the DuPonts, and other men whose names had become public symbols of the boom. Even an astrologer, Evangeline Adams, had a reserved table and paying clients who wanted the heavens to explain the tape. This was the summer when warnings did not vanish. They were everywhere. But optimism had better rooms. 2 months earlier, Raskob had given the boom its most famous Democratic promise. In his new office at 230 Park Avenue, he told reporters about a company he had been quietly planning. It would let ordinary Americans buy a basket of stocks selected by professionals. A wage earner would not need to understand every company. He would not need to be rich already. He could enter the profit system in monthly payments. The idea borrowed the emotional logic of the automobile installment plan. A family did not pay cash for a car. It paid over time, and the debt became proof of discipline. Raskob wanted to apply that same respectability to securities. A few $100s saved could control a larger amount of stock, with the rest financed and paid down month by month. That was the seductive move. Borrowing was no longer framed as gambling. It became thrift with ambition. To millions of people watching prosperity pass through shop windows and newspaper columns, this sounded less like Wall Street speculation than access. The market was not a private club, Raskob implied. It was American industrial progress, finally made available to the small saver. The phrase that would follow him into history was simple enough for a magazine cover: everybody ought to be rich. The strange thing is that some of the boom's loudest beneficiaries were not blind. Raskob worried the timing was bad. The market looked frothy to him, so he delayed launching his new company and quietly protected parts of his own fortune. Thomas Lamont returned from Paris celebrated as a financial diplomat, but in private he told his son to sell several large holdings and keep cash. Carter Glass tried to attach a tax to short-term stock trading, hoping to make speculation expensive enough to slow. The warnings were not missing. They were simply inconvenient. Publicly, the language of the summer was participation, progress, and national confidence. Privately, experienced men were hedging, selling, and preparing defenses. That gap mattered. Ordinary buyers were being invited into a market at the same time insiders were learning to protect themselves from it. The public heard about opportunity. The private rooms were filled with amendments, sell orders, and careful delays. Optimism won partly because it did not require anyone to deny risk. It only required them to believe that risk could be managed by someone else. By August, the market had become a public attraction. Mitchell walked to 55 Wall Street and found crowds waiting outside National City Bank. They applauded and called questions as he entered, as though a banker were a matinee star. The exchange superintendent noticed visitors lining up for seats in customer rooms, hoping for a clear view of quotation boards so they could watch their winnings grow. Faster tickers had been installed not only on the exchange, but in brokerage houses, hotels, and other public places. The market no longer stayed in the financial district. It followed Americans into lobbies, lounges, vacations, and conversation. Michael Meehan even opened a brokerage branch aboard the Leviathan, an ocean liner bound for Europe. Stock trading was going to sea. At the same time, Earl Smith announced that he would lead a company to build the largest office building in the world. The Empire State Building was still only a plan, but it belonged to the same emotional architecture: bigger, higher, faster, confident enough to make the future visible before it existed. Even the excess had a practical face. National City salesmen were expected to move securities through branches across the country. Hotel guests could watch the tape between appointments. A waiter could ask an astrologer for a tip and sound only half ridiculous, because everyone else in the room was asking the same question in more respectable language. Summer trading was supposed to be slow. This summer, volume broke records. Then came Labor Day. New Yorkers went to the beach to escape the heat. With the markets closed and the news thin, a reporter called Evangeline Adams, the astrologer whose financial predictions had become part of the city's entertainment. Her answer was fantastically bullish. The Dow, she suggested, could climb to heaven. The next trading day, the market reached another record. But in Massachusetts, Roger Babson was reading a different country. He saw borrowing, margin speculation, and a market rising above the economy underneath it. Steel production was softening. Rail freight had begun to slip. Industrial production had wobbled after its June high. Babson had warned before, often enough that Wall Street could dismiss him as a professional pessimist. This time, the warning carried. His words hit the Dow Jones ticker and moved through brokerage rooms in fragments. Stocks fell hard enough that the break took his name. For a moment, the machine listened. For a moment, the public saw that paper profits could disappear faster than they had arrived. That was the frightening part of Babson's warning. It did not require a conspiracy or a scandal. It only asked investors to notice that a market built on borrowed confidence could change direction when too many people tried to protect their paper gains at once. But optimism had an answer ready. Irving Fisher, the Yale economist whose confidence carried academic weight, argued that modern America had changed the old limits. Mass production, research laboratories, inventions, and corporate earning power made high prices seem reasonable. To people who wanted to keep believing, Fisher offered something Babson could not, a theory of why the new era was real. Brokerage houses reassured their customers too. Do not be stampeded by one forecast, they implied. The market was broader now, larger now, too complex for old rules. The best warning would come from the market itself. That sounded sensible, and it was comforting. Underneath, credit kept moving. Brokers' loans were expanding by enormous sums. Corporations and foreign companies poured money into the call market because short-term rates could be irresistible. Speculators found cash available. The machine could convert doubt back into buying power. Hoover was uneasy, but trapped. If he attacked speculation too suddenly, he might damage ordinary business credit. If he stayed quiet, the market could keep interpreting silence as permission. The problem had become political as much as financial. Every restraint sounded like an attack on prosperity. Every reassurance sounded like patriotism. The boom had found a way to make skepticism feel irresponsible. This was how warnings lost, not because they were disproved, but because reassurance had institutions, experts, customers, and cash behind it. By late September, the surface still looked commanding. Mitchell boarded the Olympic for Europe and told reporters there was nothing to worry about. He had just announced the great merger he had wanted for years. National City Bank would absorb Corn Exchange and become even larger. The deal depended on confidence in National City stock. Calm was not just his opinion. It was part of the transaction. Across the same weeks, Lamont moved closer to Hoover. Morgan Partners arranged privileged chances in new holding companies for friends and clients. Mellon and Hoover struggled privately while publicly insisting the administration was steady. Each room had its own version of confidence to maintain. Jesse Livermore was in a different room. In his library, with his wife nearby, he wrote notes about speculation and human nature. He had watched the Babson break. He had received warnings from London about rising rates and a British financier in trouble. He understood that a market can look strongest when unknown forces are beginning to pull at it. The summer had taught America to hear warnings as interruptions. That was the real danger. By September 1929, optimism had become more than a mood. It was a habit, a product, a social proof, and a credit system. The crash had not arrived yet. But the country had already learned how not to listen. On October 2, 1929, John J. Raskob invited 9 powerful men to lunch at his apartment in the Carlton House. The market had already changed. Since Labor Day, the Dow had fallen about 10%. The summer's confidence had not disappeared, but it had acquired a new sound: explanations, lowered voices, calls returned quickly, and men asking one another whether the public might lose its nerve. Around Raskob's table sat people who were used to moving markets, not being frightened by them: William Durant, Arthur Cutten, the Van Sweringen brothers, and others whose fortunes had been built from leverage, steel, railroads, cars, and nerve. Raskob was not blind to the danger. He had been reducing some of his own exposure. But he also believed fear could become contagious. If rich men began acting as though the future had cracked, the public would hear it. Then Raskob left the room with architect William Lamb. When they returned, they brought in a model of the Empire State Building. It was not just a building. It was an argument in limestone and steel. If America could build that high, Raskob was saying, then surely its market should not fall because men like them stop believing. This is what a bubble sounds like before it breaks: not panic, not yet, but confidence asking to be performed. 4 days later, Winston Churchill arrived in New York. He came with family, debts, ambitions, and a famous appetite for comfort. Bernard Baruch, his American friend, covered expenses and installed him near the center of the financial world. Churchill stayed at the Plaza. He used a desk in Baruch's office at 120 Broadway. He was given introductions, dinners, transport, and the kind of hospitality that made money feel less like a calculation than a climate. For weeks, he had crossed North America in private cars and elegant rooms, watching a country that seemed richer, younger, and more certain than Europe. In hotel after hotel, he noticed stock rooms. People did not merely read about the market. They sat in public spaces and watched it as a form of modern life. Churchill was not a Wall Street innocent, but he was financially vulnerable. Politics paid badly. His writing and lecture tour mattered because bills were waiting at home. Surrounded by American prosperity, he began to speculate more heavily. The important thing is not that Churchill bought shares. It is that the boom could recruit someone like him through rooms, favors, stories, and admiration. America did not have to argue very hard. It only had to invite him inside. On October 10, Thomas Lamont hosted a dinner for Ramsay MacDonald, the British Prime Minister. The guest list was small and immense: bankers, industrialists, jurists, statesmen, and the governor of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. To host a head of government was more than hospitality. It was proof that finance could sit close to power and call that closeness public service. At the table, the men spoke about peace and international order. The Kellogg-Briand Pact had promised a world where war itself could be outlawed. To the diners, it was possible to believe that modern statesmen and modern financiers were building a more rational age. Florence Lamont, listening outside the male ritual of the table, was less convinced. The optimism sounded too perfect. That doubt mattered because inside Lamont's own office, the market no longer looked simple. Russell Leffingwell, a Morgan partner with a sharper eye for danger, believed the long bull market had passed reasonable bounds. Too much credit was being pulled towards stocks. Too much public attention had turned from work to gambling. The practices underneath the boom were not clean enough to justify the confidence on top. Lamont did not want to send that warning to Hoover in such hard language. The dinner table said a new day had dawned. The memorandum said the machinery underneath was overheating. By mid-October, reassurance was still everywhere. But it had to work harder. Irving Fisher continued to defend the market. Investment trusts, in his view, were not making prices more dangerous. They were bringing the public into a broader ownership of American industry. Modern corporations, modern production, laboratories, efficiency, and national growth still seemed to him to justify high prices. The Commerce Department spoke in the same register. Industrial activity, steel, automobiles, employment, and payrolls could all be presented as signs of underlying strength. Charles Mitchell, returning from Europe, also sounded calm. The recent decline, he suggested, had done some good. It had shaken out excess and left sound securities at more reasonable levels. Each statement had its own logic. None sounded absurd in isolation. That was the problem. A bubble nearing the end does not require every reassurance to be stupid. It only requires reassurance to arrive later than the pressure it is trying to explain. Hoover heard the contradiction. From the White House, he kept turning to Thomas Lamont for Wall Street intelligence. He wanted to avoid a panic, but he also knew that silence could become permission. The president was listening for the market's real condition. What he received was a chorus of important men trying to keep their voices steady. Lamont's answer to Hoover arrived on Saturday, October 19th. It was long, polished, and optimistic. It argued that the economy remained strong, that American securities were desirable, that the spread of stock ownership might even reduce social conflict by making more citizens partners in industry. Above all, it advised against corrective action from Washington or from 23, Wall Street. Hoover read it eagerly. One of the most important bankers in the world was telling him not to be alarmed. That same morning, the market told a different story. The Saturday session ended with a sharp break. The Dow finished the week badly. Brokers had already begun demanding more protection from customers, and margin requirements that had once seemed easy were being raised to levels many speculators could not meet. This is where confidence stopped being a mood and became a mechanism. If a customer could not put up more cash, the broker sold the customer's shares. Those sales pushed prices lower. Lower prices produce more margin calls. More margin calls produce more forced selling. No one had to shout. No one had to confess that the dream was over. The paperwork did it. On the very day Wall Street's calmest letter reached the White House, the market began teaching thousands of borrowers what leverage sounded like on the way down. After the break, people wanted a person to blame. On Sunday, October 20th, the newspapers suggested that Jesse Livermore was leading a bear attack against high-priced stocks. It was an old kind of story. If prices were falling, perhaps a powerful speculator was hammering them down. Livermore was first startled, then angry, then practical. He invited a reporter to his office and made the room part of the performance. He denied leading any group. He also said what bulls did not want to hear: prices had become ridiculous. His challenge to Fisher was not academic. Fisher spoke from the authority of a professor. Livermore spoke from the authority of someone who had survived speculation by treating the market as stronger than opinion. Then Mitchell returned to New York. Reporters met him at the dock, hungry for calm. He gave it to them. The decline, he said in effect, was healthy and perhaps already overdone. If the fundamentals were sound, there was no reason for alarm. But in the same breath, he wanted easier credit. A lower rate, he argued, would help business and restore prosperity. The contradiction hung in the air. If nothing was wrong, why did the system need relief? By October 22nd, reassurance was no longer a confident announcement. It was becoming damage control. On Wednesday, October 23rd, the market opened and then began to fall through its own explanations. The selling hit major industrial names, not just speculative favorites. The pressure moved across the exchange, the curb market, and over-the-counter trading. More accounts were called. More positions were sold because they had to be sold, not because their owners had decided to leave. Near the close, trading became so heavy that the ticker could not keep up. The machine that had made the boom feel knowable was now late in reporting its own unraveling. That delay was more than a technical failure. It changed the emotional weather in every customer room. If the tape was behind, then the price on the board was not the present. It was the past. Every investor was looking at information that had already expired. Some professionals tried to find comfort. Bond dealers saw money returning to their world. Bankers muttered that people who had abandoned their work to sit in brokerage rooms might now be forced back to ordinary life. But the larger fact was simpler. The market had stopped absorbing bad news. It had stopped trusting reassurance. It had stopped moving at a speed the public could read. The crash had not officially arrived. But by the evening of October 23rd, the sound had changed completely. The rooms were still there. The telephones were still ringing. The important men were still speaking. And beneath them, the floor was beginning to give way. Before the bell on Thursday, October 24th, Wall Street did not sound like a riot. It sounded like thousands of people trying not to speak. Men filled the street outside the New York Stock Exchange before the market opened. Some had slept badly in hotel lobbies or on benches. Some had come because their savings were inside the building across the road. Police wagons blocked Wall Street. Officers stood near the doors. Messenger boys watched the adults and understood only that the morning had become dangerous. Inside 23, Wall Street, Thomas Lamont reached his office and saw the crowd from behind the Morgan doors. Across the street, the exchange waited under its marble front. This is the contradiction of Black Thursday. The bankers could calm the market for an afternoon. They could not fix the system that had brought the crowd there before sunrise. At 10 o'clock, Exchange Superintendent William Crawford struck the opening bell. The room broke at once into motion. Phones rang. Clerks shouted. Order slips moved faster than people could sort them. Selling hit blue-chip names, not just speculative favorites. Montgomery Ward fell hard. General Motors, Anaconda, Caterpillar, U.S. Steel, the companies that had made the boom look solid, became points of pressure. The first force was mechanical. Brokers had customers who could not meet margin calls. If cash did not arrive, the broker sold the shares. Those sales pushed prices lower, which created more calls, which forced more selling. In a nearby customer room, Pat Bologna, the Wall Street bootblack who had followed tips and put his own savings into stocks, pushed inside to watch. The room was not abstract finance. It was people trying to reach clerks, people asking whether they had already been sold out, people discovering that paper wealth could become a cash demand in one morning. The ticker was supposed to make the market visible. On Black Thursday, it became a confession that visibility had failed. Crawford could not leave the podium. Richard Whitney had told him to stay near the bell in case trading had to be halted. So Crawford sent messages to the engineers below, asking whether the machines could be driven faster. They could not keep pace. On the floor, rules about not running, pushing, cursing, or taking off coats disappeared almost immediately. At one post, U.S. Steel was surrounded by men trying to sell. At another, the country's best-known industrial names were being offered into a market that sometimes had no buyer at any price. That was the deeper panic. A falling price was frightening. No bid was worse. It meant the market had stopped being a marketplace and had become a room full of people asking for exits at the same time. Even spectators became part of the pressure. The visitors' gallery filled with people who wanted to see history while officials worried that the sight of an audience might make rumors worse. Crawford had heard Winston Churchill might come to watch. But by late morning the floor no longer looked like an exhibit of modern finance. It looked like a machine being asked to process more fear than it had been built to carry. Lamont watched from Morgan and understood that the old script was being summoned. In 1907, J. Pierpont Morgan had gathered bankers, forced decisions, and turned private authority into public rescue. In 1929, Jack Morgan was in England. Lamont was the senior Morgan man in New York, and the crowd outside expected someone to perform that role. He called the heads of the major banks to 23, Wall Street. Even reaching Charles Mitchell one block away took minutes because the phone lines were so overwhelmed. Mitchell pushed through the crowd from National City. Albert Wiggin of Chase came after watching the tape and deciding this was no ordinary bear market. William Potter, Seward Prosser, Richard Whitney, and George Whitney joined them around Lamont's desk. They spoke quietly, with no formal record. Each institution had reason to fear disorder. The plan was simple enough to be theatrical: commit bank money, buy the most pressured stocks, and make confidence visible before the exchange lost control. The rescue first appeared as rumor. Reporters were brought into Morgan. Lamont stood near a window protected by steel netting left from the 1920 bombing and spoke with deliberate calm. He described the selling as distress, technical rather than fundamental. He said no exchange houses were in difficulty. He did not explain the full size or mechanics of the bankers' pool. That vagueness mattered. The rescue needed to be believed before it could be understood. Not everyone believed the old script would work. Bernard Baruch refused Lamont's urgent invitation to join. To him, the market had become too broad, too public, too filled with new participants for a small group of powerful men to command it the way Morgan had done in 1907. The day when a private house could rally Wall Street by force of reputation was passing, even if the men inside Morgan still had to act as though it had not. At 1:30, Richard Whitney walked onto the exchange floor and turned belief into a scene. He moved to the U.S. Steel post and bid above the market for a large block of shares. For a moment, the crowd was stunned. Then the news moved through the room: powerful money was buying. Whitney kept walking, stopping at post after post, placing visible orders in names the market knew. The effect was immediate. The rout halted. By the afternoon close, he looked like Wall Street's white knight. But the performance was not the same as repair. It showed that banks could buy time. It did not show that the public had stopped needing to sell. After the bell, the exchange floor looked less rescued than exhausted. Men leaned against posts. Some sat on the floor with their heads down. Paper covered the room like the remains of a celebration nobody had enjoyed. Outside Morgan, reporters and newsreel crews shouted for explanations while Lamont and the other bankers met again. The day had broken records: more than 12 million shares traded on the New York Stock Exchange. The ticker did not finish reporting the day's final transactions until after 7 in the evening, hours late. At the end of the tape came another statement of confidence: the market was fundamentally sound, the worst had passed. Yet the private problems had not ended. At Merrill Lynch, an unexecuted sell order list raised the question of whether doing the obvious thing the next morning could damage the firm itself. At the Federal Reserve, meetings produced the most frightening public phrase of the day: no announcement. The bankers had made a market where there had been air pockets. They had not made the losses disappear. They also kept the rescue partly hidden. If the public knew the exact size and method of the support, it might be reassured. Or it might realize how artificial the afternoon had been. Lamont told the exchange governors a harder truth in private: no man, and no group of men, could buy all the stocks the American public could sell. That night, the crash traveled beyond Wall Street. On the ocean liner Berengaria, passengers crowded a shipboard brokerage office, waiting for delayed radio quotations to be written on a board. In Washington Square, household staff who had invested their savings on margin pulled their employer away from a formal lunch because their own ticker was collapsing downstairs. In Evangeline Adams's waiting room, anxious clients asked astrology for a kind of reassurance that banks could not provide. Public confidence kept trying to reassemble itself. Rockefeller said he and his son were buying sound stocks. Bankers spoke of value. Hoover would say business itself remained sound. But Jesse Livermore, sitting in his private trading room, heard another tempo. The market had become discordant, faster, wilder, less obedient to reassurance. The political meaning was already changing too. Carter Glass in Washington treated the break as proof that speculation and Mitchell-style finance had gone too far. Hoover's advisors warned him that individual failures and bitterness could follow once people had to explain vanished family money to wives, partners, and employers. The crash was beginning to leave Wall Street and enter ordinary blame. Black Thursday ended with a contradiction still intact. The rescue had worked just enough to look powerful. It had failed just enough to make the next question unavoidable. If the panic had been stopped, why did everyone still need the weekend to believe it? On Sunday morning, Wall Street became a tourist stop. Tour buses rolled into the financial district and unloaded people who wanted to see the place where the money had bled out. They stood under the New York Stock Exchange, looking for visible wreckage, broken glass, shell casings, some physical sign that the week had actually happened. Above them, the carved figure of integrity still watched from the exchange pediment. Below, the crowd stared back at a building that had just taught the country a new kind of fear. This is the contradiction. After Black Thursday, America kept acting as if confidence could be manufactured by ritual, speeches, dinners, and closed-door meetings. But the evidence was already moving the other way. The panic had not ended. It had changed rooms. On Monday, October 28, Charles Mitchell walked to National City hoping the public would believe in the banker's pool. The market answered almost immediately. Selling began at the open. U.S. steel fell again. The familiar blue chips were hit so hard that Richard Whitney's presence on the floor no longer looked like command. This time, simply being seen near the post could not summon buyers. The bankers met again, but the rescue had changed shape. On Thursday, they had tried to support confidence. Now they were trying to find air pockets where there were no bids at all. At the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, officials reviewed strained bank borrowing and emergency advances. No decisive answer came. At Morgan, the bankers avoided a grand statement and said only that they would try to keep the market orderly. Then Mitchell returned to his own office and learned what had happened while he was away. National City had bought an enormous block of its own shares, trying to hold up the price needed for a merger. The number was not just large. It was dangerous enough to threaten the bank itself. Mitchell's public role was confidence. His private problem was survival. That night, Mitchell went to Bernard Baruch's house for a dinner in honor of Winston Churchill. It was the kind of room that had made the boom feel inevitable. Bankers, industrialists, editors, financiers, men who had spent years converting optimism into authority. Mitchell walked into it carrying a secret. His own institution was exposed, and he needed to look as if nothing essential had changed. At the table, the mood was almost buoyant. Men who had lost fortunes could still imagine buying good companies cheap. The language of bargain hunting returned quickly, because it was less frightening than saying the rescue had failed. Baruch was different. He had been reading about crowd madness before the crash and had sold heavily before the worst days. But even that fact stayed mostly private. In public, the dinner performed resilience. That was the weekend's deeper failure. The men with the best information could admit fear only in side rooms, cables, and loans. Over brandy, they spoke as if recovery were a matter of holding one's nerve. On Tuesday morning, Mitchell decided to use his own credit to protect National City. He crossed to Morgan and asked Lamont and George Whitney for a loan. The request put pride, reputation, and family wealth on the line. Morgan agreed, not out of affection, but because a failure at National City could damage nearly every major bank. Meanwhile, the exchange floor was being overwhelmed again. Buyers disappeared. The governing board called a secret emergency meeting, not in its formal room, but in a cramped cellar space under the trading floor. Lamont and Whitney slipped across as quietly as they could. Inside, smoke thickened under a low ceiling. Governors sat on tables, stood in corners, and listened as new price declines arrived. The ticker was behind. Phone lines were jammed. Paperwork had overflowed ordinary boxes and spilled into waste baskets. Clerks and messengers had been sleeping near their work. The question was whether to close the exchange. Closing might look like protection. It might also create street markets, freeze loans backed by stock, and convince the public that the authorities had lost control. So the governors chose a smaller fiction, special holidays and shorter sessions, explained as mercy for exhausted workers. The market stayed open because closing it might have told too much truth. By the end of Black Tuesday, more than 16 million shares had traded. The day's losses were too large to translate cleanly into ordinary life. After the close, people moved through Wall Street as if stunned. One banker kept processing loan takeovers until an assistant finally told him his bank had failed. A financier refused desperate loan requests because saving a friend today could mean losing both friend and money tomorrow. At the Sheraton Netherland, music and champagne continued above the city even as one guest in the elevator called it the darkest day in American history. Jesse Livermore went home to Long Island and found his house partly emptied. Paintings, rugs, and jewels had been moved to the chauffeur's apartment. His wife had heard the crash news and assumed they had been ruined too. Livermore had to explain the cruel reversal. He had been short. As others lost money, he had made a fortune. The crash had become morally confusing. The same falling prices that destroyed one household could enrich another. That is why reassurance alone could not heal the country. People were already asking who had profited, who had lied, and who deserved blame. By November 8, the crash had moved beyond prices. John Raskob received an urgent call and rushed to Greenwich Village. James Riordan, president of County Trust Company and a close friend in New York's political and banking world, had taken his own life. Behind the personal tragedy was an institutional danger. County Trust depositors were already nervous. If the news broke too soon, the bank could face a run. Raskob, Earl Smith, and others tried to manage the disclosure until the bank could close for the day and its accounts could be reviewed. The public explanation had to be timed like a market operation. Even grief had become a confidence problem. The bank survived after emergency backing was arranged. But the scene revealed what the crash had done. It turned friendship into collateral. It turned a death in a bedroom into a question about deposits, audits, and Monday morning withdrawals. At the same time, Livermore discovered that being right about falling prices made him a public villain. Threats reached his home. He tried to reverse the story by announcing that stocks had fallen too far. On the very day that confidence appeared in the papers, the market hit a new low for the year. Hoover had wanted to treat the crash as separate from the real economy. That became harder by mid-November. Andrew Mellon, Roy Young, and Ogden Mills came early to the White House to brief him. Mellon still believed liquidation could be cleansing. Hoover was reluctant to feed alarm with words, but letters from officials and friends warned that fear was moving into banks and businesses outside New York. So Hoover spoke in the careful language he preferred. The country, he said in effect, should not confuse market pessimism with the basic strength of business. He wanted action more than rhetoric, faster public works, meetings with industrial leaders, coordinated confidence. But Hoover's problem was not only policy. It was emotional authority. Businessmen came to Washington and said supportive things, while some privately left unsure what exactly had been decided. Henry Ford offered wage increases and made himself look like the heartland answer to Wall Street. Then Blaine found a sharper voice. In the Senate, Carter Glass returned to Charles Mitchell. To Glass, Mitchell's bank had fed the speculative excess and then helped produce the disaster. The next day, Mitchell's picture became a national symbol of culpability. The crash was no longer just a market event. It was becoming a political case. In December, New York tried to look normal. Christmas windows glowed on Fifth Avenue. Shoppers admired expensive displays while a Salvation Army Santa warned that conditions among the poor were being ignored. The pit for the Empire State Building had been dug. The Chrysler Building was rising. To many New Yorkers, steel and stone still looked more convincing than the stock tape. Mitchell, meanwhile, looked for a way to turn his own losses into a tax advantage without signaling weakness. He arranged to sell National City shares to his wife, privately, through letters, while assuring her the stock was undervalued and the bank sound. At year-end, the exchange staged its own exorcism. A band played on the floor. Families watched from the galleries. Traders cheered the passing of 1929 and tried to burn the memory of October out of the room. The final numbers even allowed denial. The Dow was down for the year, but not so far that veterans could not tell themselves they had seen worse. Yet something essential had shifted. The common investor who had entered the market to avoid missing the future now had less money, less credit, and less trust. Wall Street could celebrate the end of the year. It could not make the public come back. The panic ended on the calendar before it ended in American life. In the Bronx, a man stood in a winter bank line for $2. Not $2,000. Not a broker's account. $2 in savings, small enough to fit inside a passbook and large enough, in 1930, to make him wait for hours. Around him, the rumor had already done its work. Someone said a bank would not let a customer sell shares. By the time the story moved down the street, people heard something worse: the bank might not let them have their cash. Police horses pressed against the crowd. Branch doors opened and closed. Men and women who had never cared about ticker symbols now cared about the solvency of a local bank. That is the contradiction of this episode. Leaders kept treating the Depression as a problem of confidence. But ordinary Americans were already acting on evidence. They did not need a theory. They had rent, wages, passbooks, and closed doors. A year after the crash, Thomas Lamont still looked like a man built for command. He turned 60 at his desk at J.P. Morgan, answering reporters, dictating letters, and commuting down the Hudson with newspapers laid out around him. Publicly, he remained fluent in reassurance. Privately, Morgan Partners knew recovery was not close. Wall Street had once counted on friendly newspapers and deferential profiles. By 1930, the tone had changed. Writers began describing the boom not as genius, but as salesmanship. A former National City bond salesman turned his anger into a book about the people who had sold securities to the public while insiders protected themselves. Charles Mitchell, who had once charmed nearly any room, was becoming harder to defend. The story was no longer only that prices fell. It was that trust had been sold retail, then withdrawn wholesale. The crash had become literature, journalism, and accusation. Confidence was no longer just failing. It was being investigated by people who had believed in it. John Raskob tried to answer blame with a radio microphone. He walked into an NBC studio on Fifth Avenue because the national argument had found him. Republicans accused him of financing attacks on Hoover. Editorial pages made him a symbol of the crash, the speculator who had told ordinary Americans that everyone ought to be rich. Raskob wanted to sound constructive. He talked about a 5-day work week, holidays, consumption, and investment. But the deeper purpose was political survival. If he could not erase his old market optimism, he could at least make Hoover own the present economy. That was one of the Depression's new rooms, not the exchange floor, but the broadcast studio. The old financial language had been joined by party warfare, planted stories, rebuttals, and the early machinery of mass persuasion. Blame had moved from whispered private meetings into the air. On November 5, 1930, Hoover's political fixer brought the midterm results into the Oval Office. The numbers were grim. Democrats had taken seats across the country. Hoover paced, trying to process the returns like an engineering problem. But politics was not a bridge calculation. It was a verdict. The pain had spread far beyond stock owners. Millions were out of work. Factory jobs had disappeared. Small banks were failing in towns that Wall Street barely noticed. Hoover still believed language mattered: avoid panic, speak of recovery, keep business psychology intact. The country heard something different. It heard a president saying sentiment was better than the evidence outside the window. By then, even the word depression had hardened. It was meant to sound less explosive than panic. Instead, it became the name for a national condition. And in New York, Franklin Roosevelt's easy re-election as governor showed Hoover the shape of the next fight. Then came the Bank of United States. It was not the central bank. It was a New York institution built around immigrant depositors, garment workers, shopkeepers, and small accounts. Its name sounded almost official, and that made the panic more dangerous. When a rumor spread through a Bronx branch, customers came for their money. More gathered at other branches. The biggest bankers in New York rushed to the Federal Reserve Building and stayed late into the night, trying to assemble a rescue. The room had all the old ingredients: powerful men, urgent phone calls, a merger idea, and enough money to suggest command. But this time the institution itself was too doubtful, the accounting too tangled, the public too frightened. The rescue did not hold. When the bank failed, it broke more than one balance sheet. It broke the comforting claim that 1929 had spared the banking system. Across the country, bankers drew the same lesson: conserve capital, call loans, protect yourself. That is how a market crash becomes a depression. Fear stops being an event and becomes a policy. In February 1931, Charles Mitchell sat before Carter Glass. The hearing could have become theater. Instead, it became something more revealing: two men calmly debating the machine that had failed. Mitchell blamed credit outside the banks, money that rushed in to call loans and speculation. Glass blamed bankers for finding indirect ways to do what the rules were meant to prevent. For a moment, they even agreed that corporations should not be able to pour idle funds into market loans. But Mitchell still wanted less intrusion, less inspection, and more room for Wall Street to recover on its own. Outside the homes of the powerful, the city was changing. Men slept in makeshift shelters near Central Park. Hoover, exhausted, described himself as a repairman: an international crack here, an industrial leak there, an agricultural flood somewhere else. He still believed recovery would come from the cells of the economic body. The problem was that too many of those cells were hungry, unemployed, or afraid. In 1931, the Depression stopped respecting borders. Germany was under crushing pressure. American banks had helped knit together the post-war financial system, and now those threads pulled tight. If Germany defaulted, the pain would travel back to Lower Manhattan. Lamont urged Hoover to support a holiday on international debt payments. Hoover knew the politics were poisonous. Americans remembered the war. They did not want to forgive debts abroad while suffering at home. But the alternative was worse. When Hoover finally announced the moratorium, it looked like the bold act critics had demanded. It did not hold long. Austria's banking crisis spread fear through Europe. Britain left the gold standard. Markets convulsed again. The Dow suffered its worst monthly fall yet. Gold, currency, debt, and bank confidence were now part of one nervous system. The crash had begun with stocks. By 1931, it was about whether money itself could be trusted. By 1932, Hoover was replacing generals. Andrew Mellon, once the face of 1920s prosperity, had become a political burden. Hoover moved him out of Treasury and into an ambassadorship, then pushed the Reconstruction Finance Corporation as a way to lend emergency support to banks and companies. It was a major shift for a president who had resisted direct intervention. But even this rescue carried the old anxiety: help private enterprise, but do not make it look like ordinary depositors had a federal guarantee. Glass and Henry Stegall rushed through a 1932 banking law that loosened Federal Reserve lending to weak banks. Stegall wanted deposit insurance. Glass and Hoover opposed it. Hoover also became convinced that short sellers were attacking the market and his presidency. He wanted names exposed. Senate hearings opened, but the early questioning was clumsy. Richard Whitney lectured the committee. Mitchell deflected. Raskob denied betting against the country. The investigation was meant to prove action. Instead, it showed how little political theater could repair. On election night in 1932, Hoover listened from Palo Alto as the country moved on. Roosevelt won decisively. Democrats took the House and Senate. Hoover still believed he had turned a corner, and in one narrow sense there had been calmer months. But investors remained skittish, banks remained vulnerable, and the long delay before inauguration left the country suspended between two governments. Then Democrats forced the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to reveal which banks had received emergency loans. The loans had been defended as stabilizing and discreet. Once names leaked, secrecy looked like favoritism. Depositors began hoarding cash again. In the Senate, a nearly exhausted Wall Street investigation found an unlikely new lawyer, Ferdinand Pecora, a New York prosecutor with little time and a sharp instinct for public evidence. He chose Mitchell and National City because the public had been taught to see them as safe, prudent, and almost mythic. Now letters from ruined depositors poured in. The crash had become a depression. Next, it would become a trial. At a bank window in March 1933, a teller counted out a few bills as if each one were leaving the country. The customer held a passbook with both hands. Behind him, a line waited quietly, not because anyone felt safe, but because the alternative was worse. A bank could look solid from the street and still be unable to meet the people who had trusted it. That is the contradiction of this episode. Roosevelt rebuilt confidence by first admitting confidence was gone. The banking system had to close before Americans could be persuaded that reopening meant anything at all. On February 18, Roosevelt sat at a press dinner in New York while Hoover's warning moved toward him under the table. The room was bright with jokes, skits, applause, and political theater. The envelope was not. Hoover told the president-elect that hoarding had risen, banks were weakening, gold was leaving, and public alarm had reached a dangerous height. Roosevelt kept smiling. To Hoover, that looked reckless. To Roosevelt, it was strategy. Anything he said before taking office could make him co-owner of Hoover's failure. Roosevelt first wanted Carter Glass at Treasury. Glass had credibility with bankers, Democrats, and reformers. He also had fragile health, a suspicion of Roosevelt's flexibility, and one large unfinished purpose, separating commercial banking from securities selling. He wanted sound money. Roosevelt wanted room to move. Glass asked for assurances against inflation and asked whether a Morgan man could serve beneath him. Roosevelt Circle heard the Morgan address before they heard the policy argument. Glass declined. The old bridge between Wall Street and reform would not be the new Treasury. 3 days later, Charles Mitchell climbed the steps to room 301 of the Senate office building. He arrived with lawyers, documents, and the confidence of a man who had spent years being called indispensable. Across from him sat Ferdinand Pecora, a prosecutor who did not owe Wall Street anything. Outside the hearing, states were improvising emergency bank rules. Inside, National City's president tried to make every answer dry enough to die in the record. Pecora understood the opposite. The public did not need a lecture on finance. It needed to see how privilege behaved under oath. The first crack was not a dramatic confession. It was compensation. Pecora asked about National City's management fund, the bonus pool that made senior bankers rich during the boom. Mitchell explained it as professional incentive, almost as if ordinary Americans would recognize themselves in the problem of a $25,000 salary needing improvement. Then the committee moved to the payments made before the crash, the advances that were not reported as income, and the tax consequences that followed. A system built to sell confidence to the public had built special exits for the people at the top. Mitchell could defend almost anything until the words tax purposes entered the room. He had sold a block of National City stock after the crash, he said, to recognize a loss. The buyer was not named at first. The committee pressed. The sale had helped erase his taxable income for 1929, even as customers who bought the bank securities carried their losses in public. The legal line was not yet clear. The moral line was. Pecora had found a simple image, a bank president who had asked the country to trust him while arranging his own protection at home. By the second day, the hearing room had changed. Reporters crowded Mitchell for the name of the relative in the stock sale. Spectators lined the hall. Pecora went after loans made to executives so they could hold bank stock, and after lower-level employees who were not treated with the same mercy. The mechanics mattered: a security affiliate selling bank shares, loans to brokerages, private support for the bank's own stock. But the deeper mechanism was simpler. The bank had sold safety as a product while treating its own insiders as a different class of customer. On Sunday night, after an emergency board meeting, Mitchell resigned from National City. He called it a cloud of public misunderstanding. The public heard something else. Newspapers had turned his testimony into a national morality play, and even people who disliked Wall Street spectacle could see how useful the spectacle had become. Glass stayed publicly distant from Pecora, but privately he fed questions into the investigation. His reform bill needed proof. Pecora gave him proof with witnesses, documents, and sentences short enough for the country to repeat. On March 3, the day before inauguration, Hoover invited the Roosevelts to tea at the White House and made one last plea. The stock exchange had stopped trading. Hoover's own press secretary had pulled money from his account. Fed and Treasury officials wanted a national bank holiday, but Hoover could not bear to leave office by closing every bank in America. He asked Roosevelt to use emergency authority. Roosevelt told him to do it himself. When the last call ended, almost everyone was out of ideas. Then Glass asked what Roosevelt would do once the oath was his. Roosevelt said he was planning to close them. By the time Roosevelt spoke on March 4, state bank holidays were spreading so fast the national system was already half closed. His inaugural address turned banker misconduct into the justification for federal command. The money changers had fled, he said, and Washington would restore the temple. It was a moral argument for administrative power. The next day, Roosevelt did what Hoover had refused to do. He declared a national bank holiday. For the first time, the whole American banking system stopped at once. The strange part was the relief. People improvised with scrip, credit, barter, and patience because the closure finally matched what they already knew. Pretending the doors were normal had become the danger. At that moment, emergency became permission. Closing the banks was simple compared with reopening them. Roosevelt promised that only sound banks would return, but sound was not a clean category in a depression. Regulators sorted institutions into those that could stand, those that needed reorganization, and those that had to be liquidated. There were too many banks and too little time. So the policy carried a necessary fiction. The government could not inspect every balance sheet perfectly, but it could create a ritual of inspection strong enough to make depositors pause. Roosevelt's radio address supplied the other half of the ritual. He did not tell listeners that every bank was safe. He told them the weak ones would not simply be waved through, and that money in a reopened bank was safer than money hidden at home. When banks began reopening on March 13, New York returned first. The stock exchange reopened after 7 silent trading days and surged. Wall Street had been humiliated, but it was alive. The bank holiday did not end the fight over what banking would become. National City separated from its securities affiliate. Then Winthrop Aldrich of Chase went further, calling for a broader separation that would reach private firms and weaken Morgan's old model of influence. Glass was stunned. He wanted reform, but not necessarily a war on every powerful bank. Huey Long attacked him from another direction, defending small banks and warning that branch banking would let New York run the country. The crisis had changed the incentives. Bankers no longer agreed that all regulation was bad. They began maneuvering to shape regulation before it shaped them. This was the new game. Reform was not only a moral crusade after failure. It was also a contest over who would survive the cure, who would lose a business line, and who would inherit the trust that weaker institutions had spent. On March 21, a federal marshal knocked on Charles Mitchell's Fifth Avenue door with an arrest warrant. The charge was tax evasion. Roosevelt had approved the arrest. Mitchell pleaded not guilty, hired a formidable lawyer, and returned uptown through dark streets, but the old immunity had been broken. 2 days later, Thomas Lamont went to Washington hoping to calm Roosevelt. He offered cooperation, asked for time, and warned against breaking the market. Roosevelt wanted affiliates cut off, bonuses ended, and insiders forced into the light. The bank panic forced the doors closed. Pecora and Roosevelt made sure that when they reopened, Wall Street would not walk back through them as the same old authority. Next, the trial would become the reform. In the federal courthouse, a reporter had already arranged his notes for the story everyone expected: Mitchell convicted. Charles Mitchell waited at the defense table, the old confidence thinned down to a face watching 12 strangers. The foreman paused just long enough for the room to lean forward. Then came the answer: not guilty. The verdict freed Mitchell. It did not free Wall Street. That is where the final contradiction begins: a banker could win the legal trial, while finance lost the public one. The Mitchell trial opened on May 16, 1933, in a courtroom with stained walls, worn flooring, and a crowd dressed as if money itself were on trial. The government argued that Mitchell's stock sale to his wife was not a real sale at all, but a device to erase taxes after the crash. His lawyer, Max Steuer, gave the opposite story. Mitchell, he said, was a large public target offered up to satisfy anger. The issue sounded technical: tax losses, transfers, repurchases, advice from counsel. The room understood something simpler. A banker who had sold confidence to the country was asking a jury to see his private escape route as ordinary prudence. The trial kept returning to one domestic scene: Charles and Elizabeth Mitchell, husband and wife, exchanging stock and letters while National City shares fell. Elizabeth could not take the stand. Mitchell could. He told the jury he had not dumped the shares into the market because that would have hurt the bank, its employees, and its customers. He said he had recorded a real loss, with legal advice, and had later bought the stock back to protect his wife's estate. It was a human defense, almost sentimental. But the letters made the arrangement look too tidy. What Mitchell described as family duty looked to the public like a privilege most families would never have. The prosecution did not need to prove that every juror understood high finance. It needed them to feel the distance between a household that could rearrange losses with lawyers and letters, and a country where ordinary people simply carried their losses alone. While the courtroom watched Mitchell, Carter Glass fought over the law that would carry his name. Roosevelt wanted stronger separation between commercial banking and securities business. Winthrop Aldrich of Chase, no friend of J.P. Morgan, pushed language that would force even private banking houses into the split. Glass was furious that a banker could help write the reform bill he had spent years building. Then came deposit insurance. Glass feared it would protect weak banks and reward risk. Henry Stegall knew frightened depositors wanted a guarantee. Rural America had lost too much to be satisfied with lectures on moral hazard. Reform was not pure. It was a bargain among rivals who distrusted each other. That was why it could pass. On May 23, J.P. Morgan Jr. entered the Senate caucus room with Thomas Lamont, lawyers, guards, and the old confidants of the House of Morgan. Pecora looked small beside them. That helped him. He was not trying to outgrand the grandest name in American banking. He was trying to make private power answer ordinary questions in public. Morgan spoke as if private banking were an honorable profession governed by reputation more than statute. Pecora listened with a pencil in his hand. The point of the hearing was not to prove that every custom was illegal. It was to show that custom had become a government of its own. The country had been told for years that the best men knew best. Pecora's genius was to ask what that sentence meant when the best men lent to friends, sat on each other's boards, and treated privacy as proof of virtue. Pecora asked for the Morgan Partnership Agreement. The Morgan lawyers protested. The document was private, almost sacred. Pecora won. Behind closed doors, the committee saw a bank with no public shareholders, no ordinary board, no outside examination in the normal sense, and rules that treated secrecy as part of prestige. The firm did not want small accounts. It did not advertise. It admitted clients through introductions and relationships. It held hundreds of millions in deposits while insisting it was not the kind of bank that needed to be examined like other banks. The old Wall Street answer was trust us. The new answer was show us. Then Pecora found the sentence that made the country stop reading the fine print. Jack Morgan had paid no federal income tax in 1931 and 1932. None of the Morgan partners had paid federal income tax in those years either. The deductions were legal, cleared by lawyers and accountants, and rooted in losses that the Depression had made real. Legality did not save the optics. Millions of Americans had lost wages, homes, deposits, and hope. Now they learned that the men most associated with financial authority could emerge from the tax system owing nothing. The hearing was no longer only about banking structure. It was about whether the rules had been written for the same country. Glass hated the spectacle. He accused the hearings of turning into a circus and nearly derailed the investigation he had quietly fed when it served his bill. Then the spectacle turned grotesque. A circus press agent staged a camera moment beside Morgan, reducing the great private banker to a comic tableau. The stunt was ugly, but it exposed what the hearings had already done. The giant had been made visible at human scale. Pecora then turned to favored stock lists. Morgan partners had offered select people shares at advantageous prices before the crash. The recipients included powerful businessmen and political figures. Morgan called it relationship banking. The public heard influence. On June 16, Roosevelt brought Carter Glass into the Oval Office and signed the Second Glass-Steagall Act. Glass received the photograph, the praise, and one of the gold pens. Steagall, whose insistence on deposit insurance gave the law its popular force, did not receive the same glory. The law separated commercial banking from investment banking. It created federal deposit insurance for ordinary accounts. It told Morgan, National City, Chase, and every ambitious bank that the 1920s model could not simply be repaired and reopened. The country did not get a clean morality play. It got something more durable, a rulebook born from panic, rivalry, testimony, and fear. That mattered because confidence could no longer be rebuilt by asking depositors and investors to admire character. The new system asked them to believe in boundaries. This bank cannot do that business, this deposit has a backstop, this market has a policeman. 5 days later, the Mitchell jury returned. The courtroom expected conviction. Instead, the foreman said not guilty. Mitchell wept, thanked the jurors, and walked out to supporters who cheered him uptown. The prosecution was stunned. But the verdict made a hard distinction. A jury could decide that Mitchell had not committed a crime under the law as written. The country could still decide that the law had failed to describe the injury. That Sunday, a minister in Springfield put the public feeling plainly: legality was not absolution. Mitchell had escaped prison. Wall Street had not escaped reform. The acquittal may even have strengthened the case for law. If the old rules could not punish conduct the country found intolerable, then the old rules were part of the problem. The old code broke again in 1938. Richard Whitney, once celebrated for striding across the exchange floor on Black Thursday, confessed to stealing securities from clients and institutional funds. His brother George and Thomas Lamont had tried to manage the problem privately before the truth came out. The SEC called it an unwritten code of silence. That phrase could stand over the whole decade. Before 1929, elite finance had often treated private rescue as proof of honor. After 1929, private rescue looked like concealment. Whitney went to prison. The exchange he once defended as perfect now had a federal overseer above it. The crash did not destroy every fortune. It did not make every banker a villain. And it did not prove that laws can abolish mania. It proved something harder to live with: a sophisticated society can mistake confidence for evidence, reputation for safety, and rising prices for virtue. Glass-Steagall, deposit insurance, the SEC, and the Pecora record were answers to one historical wound. They gave finance a rulebook. They did not change the human impulse that had made one necessary. Markets would find new language. Ambition would find new instruments. Hope would again dress itself as certainty. The trial of Wall Street ended with new rules. But the old danger survived. When prices rise long enough, faith starts calling itself evidence.